I'm the moderator for this. I'm Dene Low, and I write science fiction, I write fantasy, I write mystery, and I write romance. So I'm kind of what they call a genre writer. And I love Andre Norton because she was the first female science fiction writer that I ever read, and it gave me the desire and the feeling that I could also be a female science fiction writer. So I love Andre Norton stuff. I just have been getting back into her works. I've been reading some of her novels again, and reminded of so many things that became very important to me in science fiction just because of her. So I'm going to let these others, John and Robert, tell more about their ideas with Andre Norton.
Well, I'm John Olsen. I write lots of things in short stories, fantasy in novel length. So I have a couple of examples. My novel came out on this last September, but the thing about Andre Norton is she is part of the reason why I got into writing. My father was a big fan of Andre Norton. I inherited my dad's library, but growing up I read through it because he was a fan. I became a fan. I counted the books there just the other day, and there were 44 Andre Norton books on the shelf. Wow. And so about a week later, I'm at the Deseret Industries, and I see, there's 2 Andre Norton books on this shelf. I'm going to buy them just because they might not be duplicates, and sure enough, they weren't. I lucked out, so now I've got 46. And so I have a couple of samples that I brought along. Some of them are getting a little bit old and long in the tooth and starting to fall apart, so not all of them are in easy readable condition. But Andre Norton really is one of the reasons why I have always been such a science fiction and fantasy fan.
I'm Robert Starling, and I'm writer, producer, director, worked 40 years plus in film and television production. Big fan of science fiction. I read a couple of Andre Norton books when I was a teenager, but haven't really done much since then. My biggest claim to fame in science fiction was my junior year in high school. I wrote my term paper on Robert Heinlein's Future History series. But I do remember reading Andre Norton stuff, and it's a good memory.
Well, one of the interesting things is she didn't really limit herself to a narrow scope, because she has the science fiction, she has the fantasy, she has the stories that are really hard to tell which it's going to turn out to be.
Right.
And so it's kind of like you describing, you write this and this and this and this. Well, she did that.
Yes, she did. And like I said, she's the one that gave me the idea that I could do it. So since we recognize what she's done, how has this impacted you as a writer or as a creative person?
Kind of an interesting question, because reading all of those as a teenager, they kind of got ingrained into my personality. It's hard to be able to look back at that and say, oh, I do this because of stuff that I read that was hers. It's really hard to pick those things out because the effect is so pervasive. There are lots of things. I like stories that have cats in them, for instance. I don't know if that's because I read The Zero Stone when I was a teenager, or if it's just because we grew up with cats. One way or the other, that influenced me. And so I don't know that I really can pick out those influences specifically, just because it's a general influence.
Well, I'd like to talk about cats for just a second. I really liked her stories about cats. And then C.J. Cherry, maybe you read that?
Of course.
And she has cat people in hers. And I thought, oh, that's what you're supposed to do in science fiction, because that's what Andre Norton did. And so did C.J. Cherry. So Robert, were you going to say anything?
I've never really been a cat person, so I can't join that club.
Well, actually, I like dogs better, but
Dogs either.
they don't have too many stories in science fiction about dogs.
But I did notice that that her first real breakthrough novel, The Starman's Son, featured a telepathic cat. So I guess she started early with the cats.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there are a lot of things that are kind of her signature go-to themes throughout so many of her stories. I made a list of them because you have time travel, you have cats, you have ESP, you have mysterious magical powers, you have crystals, you have long-dead races, you have clear heroes and villains. These things just come out through her writing in bunches. Any story you can go through and say, oh, she hit this trope, this trope, this trope, this trope. But the thing is, she wrote them in a way that wasn't just checking the boxes saying, oh, I need an alien that's got ESP this time. She made those an integral part of the story and made them interesting.
I think that was the main point, is that she made them interesting. She almost wrote those tropes to begin with, in many cases. So if you look at where she started, her first book was published in 1947. What was going on in the world in 1947? What have we just gone through?
World War II had just come out of.
Yeah, we'd just come out of World War II. And so that had a huge influence on our culture, which made some of the stories that she told possible. So, for instance,
1947 was also Roswell.
exactly. Roswell. But if you were going to talk about 1937 as opposed to 1947, so many different things were possible in our culture. For instance, in 1937, women didn't have nearly the same influence that they did in 47, as well as part of like having a place in the workforce or having a place in other cultural things. So not only that, but we also had women who were in the WACs and the waves and the WAFs. So that all those were possible. So some of these amazing things that she has female characters do in her stories could have come from that. And you were mentioning a whole list of things that you see in science fiction and fantasy. How many of those do we see now? And can you think of anything like in?
Well, even if you look at something like magical systems, hers were a lot more hand-wavy, and so she's an awful lot more in the J.R.R. Tolkien magic realm than she is in the Brandon Sanderson variety, where he's got, there's this rule, this rule, this rule. They always do exactly this. She's more in the category of unusual powers that people have.
Well, a lot of her stuff also was associated with nature and things like that. A lot
Right.
of the things that she did. She also had an inherent distrust in a lot of her stories of technology. If you think about a lot of the stories, they had that as well.
Yeah, the Witch World side points out the very close ties to nature.
She kind of goes more into fantasy than science fiction.
Yeah, the Witch World stuff is a lot of her. Actually, I'm not sure if she did all of her fantasy writing in that Witch World.
No, there were some others. I can't remember right off the top of my head, but there were others. It wasn't just Witch World. There were some other fantasy settings that weren't Witch World.
Yeah, that was her main collection of fantasy, though.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you look at what she did and this list that he was talking about of all the different things, and in really substantial ways, those things that she put out have influenced what is possible in science fiction and fantasy today.
Absolutely.
For example, even Guardians of the Galaxy, they have some things in there that I would recognize from some of Andre Norton's stories. We expect some of these things of science fiction and fantasy simply because she put them in her books. So,
There's a reason she was called, is one of the Grand Masters of science fiction, I mean, along with Asimov and Heinlein and some of those, is because she actually set the stage for a lot of things like you're talking about.
Yeah, there are two aspects of that. There's using those ideas that already existed, but doing it well as like you were mentioning, defining new things that you could do in those stories that other people were able to take and run with later. And so you have both aspects of that there.
Yeah, you do. So you mentioned Witch World, and you mentioned some other things, but which ones of her stories do you guys remember the most, or do you think of when you think of Andre Norton?
I think the one that I remember the most from reading as a teenager would have to be this one, The Zero Stone. I'm a little bit reluctant to go back and read it because there's always this idea of, was I reading more into it than was really there? Do I have an idealized memory of it? But with some of the other books that I have reread, I haven't found that. So I think I might have to go back and reread that one now to see, okay, what was the magic that really pulled me in and made me go look for the rest of her books on that bookshelf. So,
other than the fact that your dad had them all.
yeah, they were all there ready for me to sort through, and so I just picked this one out and he goes, huh, that's got a cat. Okay.
Okay. So, which one of her series would you like the most?
And I'm kind of an omnivore when it comes to science fiction versus fantasy. And so I have read both, but I think I have preferred her science fiction stories more because she actually deals well with the science side of that. And so even though, like you were saying, she might have this strong pull towards nature, she also understood how to put the technology into the stories in an interesting and fun way.
Which was an interesting thing. She was a woman. She started writing, her first book was published in 1947. And we didn't have a lot of women authors who were making it big in 1947, especially not in science fiction and fantasy. And so then you go to one of our other big authors that you mentioned in this conference today, and that was Anne McCaffrey. And her first book came out in 1967. So there's a 20-year difference here. And tell me, are you familiar with Anne McCaffrey's work?
Yeah, that's another section on my dad's library.
The Dragon Riders of Pern.
Yeah. Yeah, I went looking for my copies and they were all worn out except for two. It made me so sad because I had whole shelves of all these books. When you could you compare Andre Norton's work with Anne McCaffrey's work?
Well, I think there are some similarities. One major difference between the two is Andre Norton, it was very clear I was reading a science fiction book versus I was reading a fantasy book. There are some that kind of blur the boundaries, but when you start into Anne McCaffrey, there were lots of people who insisted to her that this is a great fantasy book, and she says, no, that's a science fiction book, can't you tell? And so she was very adamant about what genre the stories were in, where people weren't quite so picky about that. But then with Andre Norton, it's generally pretty easy. Okay, Witch World, those are the fantasy stories, and the Time Trader stuff, that's all the science fiction side. And so in most of them, that's a fairly clear line between them.
So if you were going to tell somebody to read one of the books, which one would you tell them to read?
Well, one of the things that I do, even when I'm just at someplace like the vendor room over here, is I ask people, okay, what's the last thing you read? That's usually a better question than what you like to read, because everybody ends up being an omnivore. They'll read whatever they get their hands on that looks interesting. But the last thing that they read is generally science fiction or fantasy or urban fantasy or whatever. I use that as a way to determine which way I might aim them towards something that they are more likely to love. So it helps to get a feel for people rather than just having a blanket, I like this book here the best and you must like it too. It gives me that flexibility to point people at something that is already in their area of interest.
Okay. Robert, do you want to, what would you tell somebody to read?
I prefer science fiction because the way I understand fantasies, it involves, superpowers or supernatural kinds of things. And I went 2 years at Georgia Tech, so I'm more grounded in the sciences, I like futuristic stories with people who are people, and the technology is where the magic is, And to be able to, because technology I can understand, that even if it hasn't been developed yet, if I can see that the potential is there. I mean, we don't have warp drive yet, but if there's a thread of science that could lead us to that, then okay, I'll buy into that. Whereas strange powers and stuff like that are kind of a little far out there for me.
Okay, so you want something that feels more familiar.
Something more based in science, even if it's futuristic science.
Okay.
Yeah, I am a software engineer by trade, so yeah, I'm heavily into the sciences as well. And that's one of the things that bugs me about some science fiction is I'll be reading through something and somebody will get something wrong.
Yeah.
It's like this whole idea, someone's wrong on the internet and I must fix it. That tends to pull me out of a story. And with the fantasy story, you're in a world that's completely made up to begin with, and so you run into that less.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are reasons to go either way, where it feels more familiar, or you just want to go for the pure escapism.
You have to be able to suspend disbelief in order to enjoy the story.
Mm-hmm.
That's what science fiction fantasy plays on a lot. Okay, so any questions you guys have?
I wanted to, I liked what you were, when you were talking about her, what she gave to us at being a woman and starting early. One of the things I thought was interesting about her is just the name, Andre Norton. She chose that name specifically because it was androgynous, that she could write, and no one knew at first that she was a woman back in those early days when she was writing. I mean, her name's Mary Alice Norton, but she went by Andre because of that. But then she set the stage for so many people. One of the questions I would ask is that in terms of like when you're talking about the science fiction, how did you happen to see any correlation or whatever as far as what she was doing in terms of with the telepathic type nature of things and science, especially in like the Dane Thorson series, with the Starman's Son and those, where she would bring in both of those elements? Do you think she was trying to say something about science fiction in general, or was that just part of the story?
I'm not so sure she would have been trying to say something about science fiction more than talking about human nature.
Okay.
I think there's an awful lot in her stories where you have good people doing good things for the right reasons. You have the clear villains that they are fighting against.
That's
in
right.
most of the stories. It's all easy to tell. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. She has a very clear picture in her stories of who is doing things and why they are doing them.
That's true.
Of course, they still have challenges because that's part of the way fiction works. Things are hard for the good guys, but with her stories, it's always easy to tell. She wasn't the type to put in severely flawed good guy characters. They may have had weaknesses, but those were things that they were able to overcome or were able to succeed despite whatever minor weaknesses they might have.
That's true.
Just because it was an easy way to represent the goodness of the human character. That's one thing that really has brought me some good ideas in the writing I do. I like having that clear distinction where people have a positive view of what people can do. You put somebody in a situation where they have to make a good decision, it really makes a difference to see somebody who might not have really been all that strong in some areas decide, okay, this is the right thing to do and I have to do this because nobody else will.
Do you think she was doing that because, I mean, many people consider her like a young adult writer, is what a lot of people characterized her as. But do you think it's because she was thinking of young people when she was writing these stories, or not? My own personal opinion is I think these stories work. I don't care if you're a young adult or an adult. But
They have
anyway.
a general appeal.
You think about the culture at the time.
Oh, that's a good point.
And that she was writing. And if you look at post World War II era, then they definitely did have a very clear black and white issue or view of what was right and what was wrong. And having that very clear delineation in their stories made it more comfortable for the readers. And you think about what was wanted then was a literature that would encourage the readers to choose good over evil. And they'd had such an upheaval in their whole world at that point that to have anybody question the importance of good and evil would be very disturbing. So.
There was a quote from a writer in the London newspaper that said that she had an exuberant sense that the human need for life-shaping quests was innate. That sounds like a very positive view of life that I can buy into that.
Well, it's interesting to see how she has used two different kinds of heroes. There's the one who is the chosen one who will save everything. She has some of those, but she's also got the ordinary person thrown into extraordinary circumstances. And so it's two different kinds of things where some writers might concentrate a lot more on one than the other. I'm not sure that I can really pick that out here. She's done stories across the spectrum. With as many as she's written, it's really hard to group them and say, okay, most of the stories do this one thing. Except for like the categories that we were talking about before, the positive view of human nature.
And the one thing that I really got out of her books as a teenager was that human beings have an innate responsibility to explore and to try new things. So
The need for the life-shaping quest.
the need for the life-shaping quest. And that really influenced my desires for what I wanted to read after that. And so I really liked Isaac Asimov for the same reasons, but he missed out on some of the gender stuff a little bit. I mean, anyway. But anyway, I really enjoyed her different books. I have to say that my favorite ones were in the witch world.
Yeah, I like those.
And some of the reasons for that were that they included the fantasy idea. So other critics early on said she wrote adventure novels. And
I read one of her westerns once. I have a western. She wrote a western too.
did she?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
This one says she wrote a variety of genres from espionage,
Yeah,
She wants to sit in Colonial, Maryland. I'd like to read one of the espionage.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, once again, I think she's really a product of her time and the culture that was going on. Look at the science fiction and fantasy, what they were doing back in the 30s and 40s. And it was a lot of, well, that's when the superheroes came into being, for one thing. And people were trying things, and that's when we actually started looking at rockets and stuff. And so all these things that were interesting and new in technology kind of started showing up in her work. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So I'm more of a beginning to be a fan of her, but what, like specifically, could you guys give me a title of a book that I should start with?
Oh, boy.
Oh, I have this one here handy. If you're into the science fiction side, the Zero Stone might be a good place to start. If you're into the fantasy side, I think the Jargoon Pard may be one of the first ones she did in the Witch World series.
Witch World's the very first one that she did.
Okay, so I think this is close to the beginning, but not the actual beginning with the namesake story on there. So those might be a good one. But one thing to be aware of is you can download, I think, at least 2 stories for free onto an e-reader that at least will give you a flavor for it, so you can decide, okay, do I like this style, do I like this style? I think you can at least get a flavor for science fiction versus fantasy that way. And so it's really easy for you to do a quick test to see which of her genres you're more interested in, and then just go from there.
She did a variety. And anyway, I really enjoyed, like I said, the Witch World one's better. I think it was because it had more magic in it, and more magical type stuff in it. So, any other questions that anybody has?
One quick question. So Zero Stone, is that one that's followed by Uncharted Stars?
I think it might be. That sounds familiar. But this one, this was a first printing here, and so it doesn't actually give any other story names in it. So I would just be guessing, but I think that is right.
Well, one of the things that happened to me when I was reading her books, and when I went back to start reading them again this time, you know, however many years later, is that reading her books again just sent me right back into that era of writing in science fiction and fantasy, where it was really managed by some of the more common science fiction and fantasy tropes that were going on at the time, and so it just made me feel so Superman, and so some of the others, and if you read it, you'll start getting the same feeling of back in the 1950s and 60s, of what it was like.
Well, she wrote for, I remember one of the last ones I bought new, I remember was in the 70s when I was in college. This is a long time ago, it's since I last read them, but I think it was called Vorlober. That name still sticks in my mind, but it was, I know that I had bought it hardback, when I was in college in 76, 78, somewhere around there, so that's 40 some odd years that she's writing, at least, so.
Well, she started writing.
You said in 37.
Yeah, 47.
47, okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
47 was
30
but-
some odd years, yeah.
Yeah. So she was around for a long time.
She lived to be 93, so she had quite a...
Right.
And she started, I think, 22 was when her first novel was.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
And she was pretty prolific. was all through that time period, if I remember right, wasn't she? She wrote for a long,
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't get that many books over that time frame without having one or
Yeah.
two a year.
Exactly, and so it was fun to watch how things sort of evolved too over time. The later series, I thought, had a little more depth.
So it was interesting that later in life, when she moved to Tennessee, that she actually started a library for genre writers to give them a place to find research and things that they would need for their, and that's a very,
Altruistic.
unselfish thing to do.
Yeah. Well, you look at where science fiction was during her lifetime, and it was not a valued form of fiction. It was, except for it was popular. But if somebody was going to be in academia, they wouldn't suggest that you could go read science fiction. That was really looked down upon.
Right.
And yet it was Andre Norton and then Anne McCaffrey that made me feel like writing science fiction and fantasy was acceptable. And that was something that was really interesting for me. So,
I think her stories show that same attitude that you were mentioning, the willingness to give. She had that mindset of the heroes in her stories, of good people doing good things because it's the right thing to do. And that's one of the things that I grew up with and loved about the stories that I was reading.
And what you said there made me think of, she embodied that herself too, personally. I went to the World Science Fiction Convention back in 1976, and I remember, I don't know, talking to somebody there, but I ended up being able to get an address or something for her, and I wrote a letter, saying, a fan letter saying, I think you're great and all this stuff. She actually wrote me back and was very kind and generous in the letter, exhibiting those kinds of things that you're talking about. The question I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about Anne McCaffrey and Andre Norton, what about Marion Zimmer Bradley? Did you read a number of, because I remember one of her novels that I thought was very powerful in terms of women's rights and growth and things like that. She did a lot of that in her Darkover series, but the book The Shattered Chain, a Darkover novel, you made me think of that, because I think she did a lot of those same things too.
well, I think she did. I thought as I'm thinking about that is that Andre Norton seemed to me a very different kind of writer than Mary.
Oh yes, absolutely. But I meant in terms of female empowerment.
I think Andre Norton was definitely trying to promote things that women could do, but she was still caught in the same. She was still, pushed down a little bit because she was a woman, which is why she chose that Andre name.
Right.
So she did feel some restrictions on her and her writing.
I can't remember which author it was, but there was a female writer who she picked a pseudonym simply because it was frowned upon for anyone to be writing fiction at that time. It was like early 1900s, late 1800s, and she worked at a bank. And it would just be scandalous if anybody found out.
Right.
There was a fiction writer among the employees.
Right.
And so. And science fiction was.
Even worse, yeah.
Even worse. Definitely. I remember as a young teenager, in a creative writing class that I was taking in high school, writing a science fiction story, and having the teacher just throw it back at me and say, that's not allowable.
Oh my gosh.
So,
wow.
I thought.
I remember that.
Remember that, And it definitely makes you feel bad, and no wonder Andre Norton wrote under Andre instead of Mary.
Right.
Well, one of the interesting things, though, is she is very even-handed in her treatment of issues with gender in her stories.
Oh, yeah,
She
absolutely.
wasn't like beating a drum of saying
No.
everything has to be done this way. She had strong characters throughout all of her stories, and she didn't differentiate really. It was just, okay, I'm going to write good things about people, whatever they are, whoever they are.
Which
That's
then
true.
kind of brings up the question, how would the story be different if it's written by a male or female writer? Say a given situation, what would be different about it, and would you be able to tell that?
Mhm.
You know, this was written by a woman, or this was written by a man.
Well, my first time that I was reading Andre Norton was in the 1960s, okay, because I'm really old. And not as old as you are. And,
I'm right there with
but
you.
I remember being able to tell that Andre Norton was a woman
Oh, really?
in her writing.
What were the clues?
She could write women very well, and yet you read some other science fiction writers who try to write women. I remember one, I was just stunned because this guy was saying that this woman's dress was very feminine, it was brown. And I just went, well, that's a man writing.
That's
I can
funny.
tell it's a man writing.
That's
Well, that's one of the issues I ended up dealing with in this book is a friend of mine read through it and red line sections say, no, this is not the way things work. And it was all generally having to do with interactions between characters that kind of liked each other and stuff like that, where she told me that, well, if you do it that way, people are going to hate it. And so I
That's
have
funny.
had to adjust some of my writing to make it more universally appealing.
Mhm.
You know, when she said, would it mean that everyone would hate it, or just the women would hate it?
Well, yeah, if the guys are like me, that just breeze right through and not notice.
Wouldn't know any different.
Yeah,
You said you're a filmmaker, right? Do you know in terms of this if there were ever any films made that were based upon her works? I don't know of any
I haven't
such. Do
come
you know
across any.
if that's been done? I'd love to see them if that's the case.
I haven't seen any based on Andre
Yeah, I
Norton's
don't
stories.
think so.
And that was an interesting thing to me too, because you think about what was going on in the film industry at the time, and there were very few fantastical things that were going on. I remember.
It was the musical.
Yeah, one was a musical, one was
Well,
A carousel.
the musicals were the things of the time, fantastic
Mhm.
things. Well, you could only do them in the dream scene.
that's right, in the dream scene.
Yeah.
So I just saw, the other night, I just saw Oklahoma again.
Yeah.
There's a whole dream scene in there,
Mhm.
and there's a dream scene in Carousel, and there's a dream scene for these others, and I'm thinking that's where they got the fantasy part of the movie was going. And then they started doing other things because they found out mainly that there was the possibility to do some crazy things in film. You could manipulate the film and show a ghost like Canterbury ghost. And
Science fiction in movies, of course you got Lumiere in 1800, early on anyway, but that was kind of unusual. But in the 50s, there was this whole thing about, the Martians coming and
Right.
whatever. And then it kind of died out, and it really wasn't then until Star Trek that science fiction began to come back into movies in a serious sort of way.
Mhm.
And I remember I was listening to the guy who was a sound effects editor for Star Trek. He said that how Gene Roddenberry actually sold it to the network was, well, it's like Wagon Train.
In space, yeah.
It takes place in space.
Well, that's what they used to say a lot about science fiction. was that it was a space cowboy,
Yeah.
you know, and that's what they had.
That sounds about it.
Yeah. Any other questions? Do you just want to talk about it? I don't know. Well, thank you so much for coming and for being with us.